What's going on, guys? Welcome back to your Lake Fork Guide, and welcome back to Lake Fork. Unfortunately, that fish did not stay pinned up for me, but I wanted to give you guys an in-depth breakdown and how-to on one of the most secret offshore summer bass fishing baits that the vast majority of anglers do not know about. It's right here in my hand. To find out what it is, you're gonna have to stay tuned. I want to talk to you guys today about, like I said, a bait that is unused by the vast majority of anglers out there, and it excels in summertime offshore fishing, which is kind of the time of year we're in now. It's kind of the conditions, especially on Lake Fork, we're faced with lake being low. I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing me say that, but it is what it is on Lake Fork. We got pretty much no vegetation in the lake. Most of the fish have pulled well off the bank, so we're fishing a variety of depths at times, but we're definitely fishing main lake oriented structure way offshore at this point in the year. And this is not a bait that hasn't had national level exposure. It's had really good exposure at the top tour levels and everything else you could imagine. But for whatever reason, most people just don't gravitate towards this bait. You know, talking to different fishermen week in and week out daily, as I do being a fishing guide, I just don't hear anybody talking about using this bait almost ever. And for the life of me, I can't understand it, because it is one of the most effective baits. Not only does it work here on Lake Fork, I've taken it to any lake I've gone to fishing summer offshore structure and had great success at smaller lakes around here in East Texas, Lake of the Pines, Sam Rayburn, you name it. I've caught fish on just about every lake that I fish offshore structure in the summertime on the biffle head, the old Tommy Biffle invention, the swing head bait. Now this is something, like I said, all you guys have heard about this, but be honest with me in the comments now. How many of you guys actually use this on a regular basis when you're fishing these conditions in the summer? From my experience, hardly anybody does. I would say probably about 90% of anglers out there don't even really throw this, and if they do, they make a couple casts with it and then pick up something else, be it a jig, a big worm, or whatever they prefer to use through the summer. But for whatever reason, this bait right here just does not get utilized by most of y'all, and I cannot express to you how deadly it is. Now, this one right here is the 6 cent swing head. They make several companies out there make them. The original Biffle head's great. There's a bunch of different companies that have these swing heads. The one I use is 6 cents, of course. The one thing I do like about it is the screw lock that it comes with right there. You guys can see that little screw lock hanging down. Man, that's going to prolong the life of your bait. It's going to make you spend less time digging around the tackle box grabbing new plastics, because your baits won't tear up nearly as bad on that screw lock as they will on, say, a regular EWG style hook, which is, I believe, what the original Biffle head comes with, like just an EWG style hook, and you kind of rig the bait up on there and just pop it on the little notch on the EWG hook. But with this one, I simply screw it on right there. I kind of measure where the hook's going to come out, then I poke the hook all the way through. This is important. Stick the hook all the way through the bait like that right there, and then Texpose it or skin hook it back into the bait where it's completely weedless, as you see. But I don't have very much plastic. A fish comes up here and bites this, the hook pops right out. So that's what you want. That's how you rig the bait up on the swing head. 3/4 ounce is the one I use probably most of the time. I mean, very rarely, if it's super windy, I do keep a couple 1 ounces. If it's super windy, I will go to a 1 ounce. A 1 ounce is going to tend to hang up worse than a 3/4 ounce. Usually I'm fishing deeper offshore structure. There's usually a little bit of wind in Texas most days, so the 1/2 ounce really is too light for me. That 3/4 ounce seems to be the right size for most applications for this technique. As far as my rod, reel, and line go, you know, you're going to want a heavy action rod. I like to fish this basically on the same rod I would fish a jig on. It's about a 7.5 foot heavy action rod. This one that I have here is 7.7 heavy. That's the kind of rod. You're going to want a big rod. I will say this. Anytime you're fishing a dragon bait, be it a jig, a big shaggy head like we talked about a couple weeks ago, big worm, Carolina rig, or a swing head or biffle head, whatever you want to call it, you're going to want a rod that has some sensitivity. So spend a little extra money, get a little higher dollar rod if you can afford to, and go ahead and get you a better quality blank. You'll have more sensitivity. It'll also be lighter, which is nice too. On line, I'm throwing 20-pound fluorocarbon 100% of the time. On a reel, I'm always using a high-speed gear ratio reel. So that's the gear. Now let's talk about the areas that we're going to fish it. You know, you can fish this thing anywhere you would offshore summer fish. If you're going to be fishing very heavy timber, tall standing timber like we have in some places on Lake Fork, this is probably not the best bait. In that situation, I would probably opt for a Texas rigged worm over the swing head or biffle head. But most of the offshore places that we're going to fish, well, we're going to be fishing with bottom contact, okay? We're talking about points, humps, ledges, road beds, pond dams, old sunken bridges, anything like that. This bait excels at all those type of areas. Now, the key thing is the hard stuff. Whatever the hard stuff is, if on your lake it's rock, if on your lake it's shell, we have a mixture of both, and even some really washed out hard clay at times here on Lake Fork. On the hard spots, that's where this bait excels. Let me explain to you why. The strong point, right? The selling point to the fish, so to speak, on this bait in this rig is the action behind the head. So when you're rolling over mush bottom, that head's not really bouncing around at all. It's just kind of sliding across the bottom. Well, that bait's just going to kind of slide behind it. But when you're on a hard bottom, let's say it's bumpy like my fingers, right? And you can kind of see that bait, if you watch it as it goes on my finger, that bait will pivot a little bit. Just a little bit of pivot. But if you add the buoyancy to the water, when that bait goes over something hard, that bait's going to kick around and swim around and really have a lot of action behind it. And that's where the strength of this bait comes in, is that more wild action, more erratic action that it has when this bait is bumping along something hard. So you want to find hard bottoms, you want to feel the hard bottom, and you really want to keep that contact and make that head of that bait kind of bounce over those hard spots in the bottom, because that's going to give that bait all that much more action. As far as the baits that we're going to put on this application, you know, the biffle bug is actually the very best one in my opinion. It has kind of an air bladder in the middle of it. It's got those little appendages that swim with very little water pressure. Hey, that's going to be important. That's the kind of bait that you want to fish on this rig. And I do think, you know, the guy that designed the head, Tommy Biffle, also designed the biffle bug to go with it. And I think that's why it works the best. But there's other options, you know, and the reality is around Lake Fork, for whatever reason, biffle bugs aren't really sold around here. I have to order them online. I don't have any in the boat right now. So what do? I've been going to the stroker crawl. Again, thin appendages that move without much water resistance, as you can see on the legs on that crawl bait right there. Another bait that can work on this at times, especially on these pressured lakes like Fork, is a beaver style bait like this one right here that just has these little thin legs coming out. Now that's not gonna have much action at all, but a little bit of pivot makes those things kind of dance behind it like that, and those legs get to twitching with a more subtle action. Hey, on a more pressured lake, that more subtle action can get you bites that other baits wouldn't. But overall, day in, day out, water body in, water body out, I would say the biffle bug is your best option on the biffle head, of course. All right, guys, now let me get up and show you guys how I'm fishing this bait over cover, because there's a couple unique things I do to try to get bites, like I said. All right, so right out here in front of me, I've got a nice little hump with a lot of hard stuff on the bottom. Like we said, that's a big key. There also happens to be some brush scattered across here, so there's going to be differences in how I move this bait in the water column when I'm fishing it over the hard spots versus when it actually contacts the brush. When I start feeling the brush, I'll change my approach. Let me explain to you how I do all of that. So we're going to make a cast out over this hump right here. Let that bait go ahead and sink down to the bottom. And as I start my retrieve, I'm gonna hold my rod tip down and I'm gonna slowly drag the bait where I can feel everything. You can drag it up like this, especially when there's light winds. Like right now, we don't have much wind. But if there is any wind at all significant, you're gonna wanna drag it down like this. That'll give you more sensitivity. Also, when you drag it up, the bait tends to climb over more and that head doesn't dig into that hard stuff as much. You actually want that head to dig into that hard stuff to give it that bouncing action and give that bait behind that swing head a lot more action. So we're gonna go ahead and drag it down. This is how I always present this bait. You can see some resistance on my line right there. I'm kind of coming up the soft spot of the hump right now. I'm not feeling the hard stuff. Now I'm starting to feel a little bit of hard stuff, and you can watch my rod tip bounce a little bit if you watch real close. See my rod tip starting to jump a little bit. It's not very hard yet, it's still pretty soft. There's a little bounce. That's a good bounce right there, and that's what you want. Bounce, 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 bounce. Now, one thing about the biffle head is, you know, a lot of times with a big shaky head or a jig, we want to present that bait extremely slow and almost let it sit still at times. This one, you actually want to keep it moving because that's where it gets the action from. So check out what we do here. This is actually the speed. On a shaky head or jig, I'm going to go one bounce at a time, real slow like this. But on this biffle head, I'm actually going to go, and you can feel bounce, bounce, bounce. If you watch that rod tip real close right here, you'll see it bounce. Just little bounces because I'm going faster, but it bounces right over all that hard stuff. There was a good bounce, there's a good bounce. But you want to go ahead and move that bait. Now, the key thing about that is don't go too fast, because that bait will start climbing off the bottom. Especially the deeper water you're in, the more tendency it'll have to rise. You got to keep contact with the bottom, guys. Now, hopefully here in a minute I'll hit this brush pile and show you guys the difference. So now I've come into contact with that brush, and as I get here, my bait's kind of stopping. I am now, regardless of wind or anything else, going to lift the rod tip and drag the bait up as much as I can. That's going to help the bait climb up the brush and come back down, and up the brush and come back down. A lot of times in brush piles on this bait, you'll get a bite after the bait climbs up. When it starts to fall, that's when you'll get your bite. So you really got to watch your slack line. When you climb over that brush and it releases, your line's going to go slack. You have to follow your slack and watch it, because they will bite it on slack line and you'll have a hard time feeling it, but you'll see your line actually jump. All right, so like we said, we're in that brush pile, so now we're gonna lift straight up, and it's climbing. I feel the tension, climbing, feel the tension, still climbing. Right there, it went over. I'm gonna point my rod back down and watch my slack right here. Slack goes all the way down, falls. Now I'm gonna climb the brush pile again. Do I feel anything? No, I don't. Now I'm gonna drop my rod tip back down. So I just went over one limb in that brush pile. Now I'm back to dragging it like we were before. As far as a hook set goes, guys, you know, this one that I use got a big hook in it, and the biffle heads have big hooks as well. Most of the swing heads that I've seen have pretty heavy gauge, heavy wire hooks. That's one of the reasons we're also using a heavy action rod. Something that's important is basically how you set your hook on any bait that you're utilizing is determined by how heavy of a gauge the hook is. So if you've got a big, stout, heavy hook, man, you've got to drive that nail home. If you've got a little thin wire hook like some shaky heads have, or a drop shot, you can just pull into them and kind of pull the bait into the fish and get a good hook set. Think of it like this. If I had a finishing nail, I could walk that finishing up nail to a piece of plywood or a 2x4 and push that finishing nail into that board with my thumb. But if I had a big old 10-penny nail, I'm gonna have to beat the heck out of it with a big heavy hammer. Same thing with your rod size and your hook set. If you've got a lighter wire hook, you need a lighter rod. If you've got a heavier gauge hook, you need a heavy rod, and you need to correlate your hook set and match your hook set up with the rod and the gauge of the hook that you're using. So on these, we get a bite. Here's a key thing too that I see people mess up on, man, on all these dragging baits offshore. Crankbait, jig, or a shaky head, jig, it doesn't matter. If I'm dragging along right now, I get a bite. People want to just reel down and swing. That is the wrong thing to do. A lot of these fish will bite and drop, or bite and not have it good. If I get a bite right here, I want to drop my rod tip and slowly reel up my slack, and then I want to feel. Now, if he's still here, that gives me time to get my right foot behind me, and that's going to allow me to get a lot of leverage on this hook set. So I'm going to take a drop set with my right leg, and I'm going to swing this rod as hard as I can up to my right shoulder. Okay, always swinging it to your right shoulder. I see guys sweeping the rod down here. I see guys setting it straight up like this. You want that rod to go right to your right shoulder on the hook set. So I'll go ahead and hold this bait in my hand so I can show you guys. But full speed, it's going to look like this. I'm dragging, I'm dragging, I'm dragging. I get a bite, tick, point down, reel up. Do I feel him? He's there. Put my right foot behind me, right to my right shoulder, hard as I can. Did y'all hear that sound? If you're not hearing that sound when you're setting a hook with a big gauge hook, you're messing up. All right, guys, that's how you fish the old swing head, biffle head. I don't know what it's called. It's a fish catching machine that most of the anglers out there, probably about 90% of them, just aren't using for summer offshore bass fishing. Be sure you get you some biffle bugs, get you some stroker craws, and I promise, if you guys haven't fished this before, it's going to get some fish to bite that you've been missing out on. Good one too. Get up here. See, folks? The old biffle head, swing head. Most people don't use it. They sure do like it. Right there. Look at that funky tail on it. It's so weird looking. Good fish, kind of funky built, but hey, he fought good anyway. We'll take him. Thank you so much for watching as always. I certainly hope that this helps you catch more and bigger fish. We'll see you next time right here on your Lakefront Guide.